Good evening, everyone. As we start, please join me for a short word of prayer. Father God, you are so faithful. Thank you for this opportunity to savor learning again about this very important topic. We praise you, God, for this initiative of the IAS administration. Thank you for their desire to equip us into beautifully shining missionary families in the field. And Father, we would like to thank you for the availability and the expertise of Dr. Hernandez. Thank you, God, for giving us Dr. Barbara to guide us and give us so many new learnings. And Lord, we really pray that you will bless our time. You will bless the people who have joined us tonight, and we will join together in praising you, that again we will be filled with so many things that we could carry on as we journey in this life. Thank you that you will bless our technical team as they take care of the things that they needed to do for this webinar. We also would like to pray that you will give us a good internet connection so that this webinar will be running smoothly. Thank you, God, for hearing our prayers. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Welcome to the Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies President's Series. I'm Ginger Ketting Weller, the president of IAS, where we prepare leaders for the Seventh-day Adventist World Church. This President's Series was developed because many leaders have never been able to access practical training to do their work better. As we ponder the need for co-curricular training, we realized that we needed to start with the family. If leaders do not know how to create healthy family dynamics, it can wholly compromise their work and mission. A happy marriage leaves you free to do your missional work without bearing the burden of unhappiness at home. Healthy parenting skills reduce the possibility that your children will suffer and grow up with wounds while you are out preaching the gospel. Knowing the elements of healthy relationships also equips you to better handle the relationship issues that might crop up in your work. You can be so much more effective in family and mission when you understand these principles. For this series, we have invited an expert to teach us for this 2021 to 2022 school year. Dr. Barbara Couden Hernandez has a background in nursing, as a licensed marriage and family therapist, as a professor in the area of marriage and family, and now as the Director of Physician Vitality at Loma Linda University, where she is also a professor of medical education. In essence, she is a counselor and professor for the doctors who often have to deal with stressful situations where they're expected to be the leaders. What better person to teach us as well? Thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez, for being willing to share with us from your insight and knowledge about how to develop healthier relationships and healthier families. I am praying that this series will be a blessing to all of us. I pray that you will learn much through the 12 sessions and that your family, your ministry, and your leadership will become much stronger as a result. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ginger, for your very beautiful welcome remarks. And hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining the IAS community in our seventh session of the 12-part webinar series on healthy families. Tonight, with the topic sex and sexuality, healthy approaches for families. My name is Bethel and I'm your moderator tonight. It is a very relevant topic. I know you would agree with me that we will be exploring tonight. So we hope that you will glean not just new information, but life's deep and practical lessons to carry along as we continue to navigate on this issue in our daily lives. Before we get to the presentation, let me go through some housekeeping. We would like to remind our attendees here in Zoom and to people joining us on YouTube and Facebook Live that we welcome your questions. We will have 15 minutes for the question and answer right after the presentation. So please do not hesitate to type in your questions to the chat box and in the comment section. Take note, your questions play an important role in making this presentation more practical and relevant. Lastly, it would be very helpful to keep the smooth running of our program to have your microphones muted during the entire session. All right, let's dive right in and turn the time over to Dr. Barbara Hernandez for her presentation on the seventh topic, sex and sexuality, healthy approaches for families. Dr. Barbara, it's your time.
Thank you very much. Seven is a perfect number in the Bible, isn't it? And here we're talking about human sexuality, and I don't think that's by accident. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk about these topics with you today. As I have been saying all along, I do want to remind you, there are such regional and cultural differences, and we must be respectful of everyone's viewpoints and how people think. I am sharing this with you, with this topic with you as a lifelong Adventist Christian who also lives in Southern California in the United States. So I recognize that we might view things very differently here as in other parts of the world. So as we have been doing all along, consider the principles, consider the guidelines, consider the things that are suggested, and then take those things, synthesize those into something that can be useful for you in your setting, because this is absolutely critical. We always meet people where they are. We always think carefully about what we say, rather than just to say, this expert said this, or Jesus said that, or Ellen White said that. We have to apply what we hear to our context in a thoughtful way using biblical principles. I'm going to share my screen here with my slides and get these up for you now, and we will get started with those. I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about sex and sexuality. Incidentally, you'll see that it's sex and sexuality, healthy approaches for families. So we're going to be talking about a wide variety of issues here as they pertain to families. First of all, I'd like to start thinking a little bit about how the church began thinking about sexuality. And then we're going to define sexuality, and then we'll be talking about sexuality over the lifespan, how to talk with our families, and then how should we consider sexuality as a very critical and important part of our relationships. As you know, this is a topic where being candid is really important. So I'll try to do that while also being very considerate and sensitive with this very important topic. Sexuality and Christianity, let's talk about that. What does the Bible say? We always go to the Bible first, don't we? And it's really interesting how sexuality in the Bible is a very robust, very joyful experience for the most part, and plays a very central figure. In Genesis, for example, there are about 37 stories where sexuality and sexual behavior plays a central role. Let's start with Genesis 2:22. This is about creation. And the rib, this is about Adam, the rib of Adam, which the Lord had taken from man, made he a woman and brought her to the man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Very interesting how men and women were created together in the Garden of Eden. And that clinging to one another or cleaving, this is the Old English word, cleaving to one another, was not necessarily mentioned in reference to procreation. It was a stance they were to take toward each other, that they were now one, that they were one flesh, and their nakedness brought no shame. How lovely this is. This next verse, marriage should be honored by all. This is from the Pauline works of the book of Hebrew. Marriage should be honored by all. It's honorable. The marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. In the early church, there were some influences on how people thought about sexuality and sexual behavior. As you know, Plato, both Plato and St. Augustine, who was an early church father, said, the spirit is righteous, the spirit is good, but the body and matter are evil. But the spirit is noble. What a tragedy that we started to separate different parts of ourselves from our body proper. And this is how we began to think, so that in some of the early church, and I'm talking early church as in the 1100s, 1200s AD, that sex and enjoying sexuality was considered sinful, carnal, inappropriate, only for procreation, and the notion of cleaving to one another, loving one another fully in Christ, honoring marriage was lost. So I'd like to make a distinguishing comment here. When we hear the word sex, we often think to either a behavior, an act, a sexual act, or we think of a biological identifier, which requires us to identify by our sex, male or female. That's what we often think of. Sex is something we do, or it's what we call ourselves, when in fact, we often mean the term sexuality. Sexuality is something we are. It's something we are created with. It's how we express a sense of our gender. It's how we express our masculinity or our femininity, or our enjoyment of being embodied in this particular body. It's a sense of being sensual. It's a sense of being connected and identifying ourselves. So sexuality is much more about how we show up in our society, how we express our sense of being a sexual being, and not so much about an act. So let's think how we can be more discriminating in the language that we use. I realize that this is the English language, where the English language is not germane to many of the settings of people who are hearing me this evening. So it might be different for you, but let's be careful how we use words around how we identify ourselves, how we embody being a sexual person versus something that we do. Now, Dennis Daly has suggested that when we think about sexuality, we have to think of at least 5 different domains. Each one has roots in our values. So let's think about what this is first of all. Let's start with the red circle on this picture. Sexual health and reproduction. This is what most of us consider sex or sexuality, how we have children, how reproduction occurs in the woman's body, how men contribute to a baby in utero. This is what we think, how we avoid sexually transmitted diseases. So this often is one of the cornerstones, certainly of medical education where I teach. And so we consider our medical professionals to be experts on understanding reproduction and sexual health. This is only, however, one aspect of our sexuality. Let's look at sensuality which is the bright blue circle in this picture. Sensuality is the ability to enjoy our bodies as sexual creatures. What good sensations we have. And sensuality isn't always just related to intercourse. Sensuality is also wearing something that feels good on our skin. It's also being cuddly. It's also the enjoyment of the feelings, the sensations that come with emotional connection, physical connection with someone else. So sensuality is very important. For some reason, the church, and I mean the larger church of Christianity as a whole, has often thought sensuality is something evil, that we should not have a sense of a positive sensuality. Yet, sexual experience is almost impossible to enjoy without being able to enjoy the sensuality of that experience. Now, in some languages, the word sensuality is translated into something that is earthy and sensual, as Paul described sensualization as something bad. So let's think carefully about how we use this word. In this particular description, I'm using the word sensuality as something that we can really enjoy in our bodies as we join our bodies with someone else, positive feelings. And even if we are not joining our bodies with someone else's body, what we are enjoying is the sensations of smooth things on our skin, warm things on our skin, being comfortable in our own skin. Now, sexualization, the bright pink circle in this diagram, is something that we often don't think about as part of our sexuality. And this is the way we use our bodies to our advantage over other people. Now, what in the world do I mean by that? Sexualization of our body actually refers to a wide range of behaviors that goes on a continuum from enjoying a seductive behavior all the way to using sexuality or sexual experiences or behaviors to somehow dominate someone else. This refers to behaviors that influence the way we view sexual experience. And that might be through exploitation experiences, or by being sexually molested or assaulted. It can also mean it can refer to behaviors where we use our sexual prowess to influence other people. Sometimes that might mean sexual harassment. Sometimes that might mean being very seductive. So there can be a range of negativity in these experiences, all the way from being victimized to enjoying the innocence of our spouses behaving in a seductive manner, which is perfectly appropriate in a marriage. So I think you can understand that there's a range of behaviors under sexualization that can have a positive or a very negative influence on how we experience sexuality and how we embrace our own sexuality. Intimacy is another aspect of our sexuality, and this is the ability to be emotionally vulnerable with another person, to invite another person into our most vulnerable part of our experience, and to welcome that of another person. So many times we hear people, at least in English-speaking countries, say, were they intimate? Well, I hope so, if we use the description that I just used. So when people are intimate with one another, this refers to a very close, transparent emotional connection. People often use the word intimacy to describe a sexual act. So this is, when I use the word intimacy, I'm using Dennis Daly's term, which means emotional transparency, inviting someone into a very vulnerable aspect of our lives. Now, sexual identity is another aspect of how we experience our sexuality and our sexual experiences. And this means how we identify our sexual experience, our own sexuality within ourselves. This refers more to biological sexual identity. Do we identify as male or female? Do we identify as non-binary? Do we identify as gay or straight? Do we identify as polyamorous or monogamous? So you see, there are a lot of words that you hear in society today where people identify themselves as various things, various types of sexuality. So we look at this diagram and we say all of these things play a major role in our sexual experiences and in our experience of being a sexual person. I hope this really helps you think about how you use language around sexuality, because healthy sexuality will be mindful of all of these things. Now, I am currently at Loma Linda teaching medical students a sexual health class. It's called Sexual Health, Addressing Sexual Health in Clinical Practice. And that might mean any one of these aspects of patients that we see in a clinical setting. Someone might not be able to be transparent. In other words, their ability to be vulnerable is compromised. Maybe they're having difficulty understanding their sexual identity. Maybe they've been missexualized by sexual abuse. Maybe they have real difficulty with feeling sensual or arousal. Maybe they're not sure what their values are. So maybe they're pregnant and there's some sexual reproduction issues to address. So you see, we can never assume that when someone says they're having sexual issues, that it's any one of these aspects. So let's move on. Let's see, the World Health Organization has created a very interesting statement and definition about what sexual health is. Let me share this with you. It's sexual health is a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being in relation to sexuality. It is not merely the absence of disease, dysfunction, or infirmity. Sexual health requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences, free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. For sexual health to be attained and maintained, the sexual rights of all persons must be respected, protected, and fulfilled. I like this statement. I think it's very helpful because it reflects that sexuality and sexual experiences are protected. They must be safe. We must be safe in our sexual experiences, as must all people. So I'd like to share with you a model of sexual behavior. For any sexual exchange to be safe, to be respectful, it has to have these elements. So bear these in mind. First of all, consent. This means choice, that you have a choice of participating in a sexual experience. Or you can say, I'm not going to participate in this. And this is true for married couples as well. If you remember what the Apostle Paul said, he said, be mindful of each other, that women serve men and men treat women as though their body and their experience is their own. So we can't lord over each other as though this is your due. You'd better provide a sexual experience for me. This is not how it is in many relationships, unfortunately. And usually women are the ones who are told, You must be sexual on my behalf. Consent is important. If it's not consensual behavior, it is coercive behavior. Equality. We must behave in it and respect each other, not dominating one another, but being co-independent on each other. That we are very cautious that we enter into this with not one person dominating the other, but both being co-independent for the experience. Third, respectful. We are respectful of each other. We don't engage in behaviors that will diminish the respect we have for each other or for ourselves. This is really critical. What this tells us is that exploitive behavior, telling someone they must behave sexually in a specific way when they don't like that behavior, when they find that painful or inappropriate to them, is not respectful sexual behavior. Trust must be present in order to share our sexual behavior with another one, that we respect the vulnerability and the sensitivity of the experience, that we don't exploit the experience for our own personal gain, whether it's going and telling someone else about what happened in an intimate encounter, a spiritually intimate encounter, a sexual encounter, or about someone's sexual experience or sexuality. Lastly, there should be no fear. There should be no concerns that we will somehow have our safety jeopardized by engaging in any kind of sexual behavior with appropriate partners, or that we will have to worry about becoming pregnant or getting a disease from our partner or being injured by somebody else. This model was created by Wendy Maltz, who is a social worker who works with individuals who have been sexually exploited, sexually abused. And she said, this is a good guide for those individuals who are uncertain what a healthy experience is in sharing sexual behavior with someone else. All of these elements should be present at any time. Now, if she's telling people who are survivors of sexual assault that these things must be present at all times to have a safe and healthy sexual experience, what must we think who have sexual partners, who are married, who have spouses? How much more important are all of these elements in a sexual experience with a married partner? Now, I want to just take a little bit of time and talk about sexual development in children, because, you know, this is a talk about healthy sexuality in families. And did you know that our children are sexual creatures too, all the way down to infancy? In fact, some of the behaviors that babies demonstrate are very sexual when they're tiny babies. Even when they're newborns, some children can behave in some sexual behaviors. They move their bodies in sexual ways at times. It's not because they're evil or they're looking for a sexual partner. Their bodies are built and created and designed to be responsive and to also find that some sensations feel better than others. So, what do we do when we have little children, babies up to 2 years of age? They are so innocent, and we want to keep them that way. Some of the things that we do as parents is we teach them proper names for body parts. Let me just stop up for a moment and mention something about this. If we think about the names, the nicknames, the slang that we use in families, it might be specific to your family. Make sure it's respectful for both males and females. One of the things that we notice is that little boys, when they are learning how to use the bathroom, how to be potty trained, as we use that term in English, when they are being potty trained, they go to the toilet, they hold their penis in their hand, and they do this several times during the day every time they urinate. And when they do this, the mothers and fathers cheer. This is wonderful, because they were able to use the toilet and not soil their clothes. When little girls use a toilet, they sit on the toilet, they can't see their genitals. They don't know what's down there. And we develop these terms for down there that become euphemisms that don't describe a little girl's anatomy appropriately. And we also say to little girls, don't touch down there because it's dirty. It's no more dirty than a little boy holding his penis and getting urine on his hands. But we don't say to a little boy, don't touch down there, that's dirty. So you see, from a very, very young age, we are teaching our little girls that they should be ashamed of their bodies and that they don't have the right to touch their own body. You see, a double standard occurs very early, and this is mostly anatomical, but this registers with little girls when they think that they have to very carefully wash their hands because something is dirty and dark and invisible down there. So let's use appropriate language. If we're going to say, use little terms for boys' penises like a wee-wee, let's use something corollary and innocent for little girls so they don't feel dirty and that they can't see what's down there. Early childhood, little children are quite curious about how they're made, what their body is. They're very uninhibited, and this is a delightful time. I know that, as I've mentioned before, when I sit with families and I'm talking to them about what's happening in their family, I can count on the 4-year-old to blurt out exactly what's happening in the family without impunity, or with impunity. They just will say whatever they want to say. And the parents hold their breath when they have children these ages, because they might say anything. When it's time to pray in church and the child is handed the microphone, you're never sure what they're going to pray about, because maybe they saw something in the house that week and the parents are going to turn crimson. Well, children are known at this point in their lives for saying things about body parts in public. They might say, oh, I have a penis, Grandpa, you have a penis too. Well, Grandpa might not want to be thinking about that, and it might not be polite in a larger group to be saying these things. So children have to be taught in a very gentle and kind way when it's appropriate to say things, when it's not. Many children want to play doctor with each other, and they want to see each other's genitals. This in itself is a very innocent thing. And I think many parents panic that they're growing perverted, deviant children when they might catch their children under a bush with their pants down, looking at each other. At this age, this is a very innocent thing, and we have to say, this is private. Your body is private. Wherever a swimming suit covers is private, and that's just for you. And we don't show that to anyone unless it's a doctor and unless mommy or daddy are with you. So we don't show our bodies in that way. Now, in saying this, I realize that around the world, there are many societies where children in a family run around naked, parents in the family run around naked, and that's acceptable. So again, we have to translate this principle to each of our family homes and our cultures. But what we know is that there is a range of normalcy in every culture for what children are allowed to do. What we don't want to do is make them feel ashamed of their bodies and ashamed of nakedness. but we teach them what is appropriate. In middle childhood, this is where you have children, again, very curious about bodies, how babies are born. Why is that lady's tummy so big? How did the baby get in there? They might use slang words that they've heard that they might not have the cognitive ability to understand, but since they heard it, they'll say it. And this is a time when it's really important to say, now that's an interesting word, or that's an interesting term. Where did you hear that? Rather than just automatically punishing them because they might not understand what it means to use a certain word. They might not have the understand the implications of what they're saying. And so it's important to say something like, well, now that's interesting. Do you know what that word means? Tell me what your understanding is. And then you might be able to correct that and say, that's not a word that we use. Or we just, in our family, we don't use that word. It's not appropriate. It's crude language. This is where in middle childhood, we see children act in more gender-specific ways. You might see little girls playing house, and you might see boys building things, very gendered behavior. You might see signs that the children are masturbating. And there's a big question about whether this is something you should stop or whether this is appropriate. As I've mentioned, we see sometimes babies in the hospital. In the first few hours of their lives, we see their little bottoms going up and down in the bassinet sometimes. We have to realize that some behavior is very innocent. And we can't consider that any self-stimulation or self-exploration is evil. What we have to do is set limits around some of this behavior. When you see children who are masturbating compulsively, constantly, every chance they get, there are a couple explanations. One, they might just have discovered their genitals and that their genitals feel good when they're stimulated. Or someone else might have stimulated their genitals, or they might have been exposed to something inappropriate for their development that is sexual, and they're acting out. So it's important that you don't just automatically punish a child who masturbates, that you understand why they're doing that. And if it's an innocent experiment, or whether it's something compulsive, those are two very different things. Masturbation is a very normal thing. So what we have to do is make sure that children have activities that they enjoy doing, many things where they are with other people, but also to recognize that this is a normal aspect of life and that it helps children understand how their body works. If they're fixated on their genitals and genital stimulation, that's another issue. But again, we set boundaries around behavior to say, God made us in a certain way to enjoy our bodies, and it's designed to enjoy our bodies mostly in marriage. And so it's wonderful that you've discovered that, but we save this experience for very special times. Late childhood, this is when children suddenly become very, very modest. They want to cover everything. They don't want anyone to see that maybe they're starting to develop breasts or pubic hair or armpit hair. At this time, they start having friendship groups. They want to have a club at school where everyone says a certain password or behaves a certain way to belong. They're curious about nudity at this point. They might be very curious about how bodies look different. And this, again, is a time for you to be talking with them and answering their questions and respecting their modesty. Teenagers, well, hold on. By the time they're teenagers, their peer relationships are more important to them than their parent relationships in many cases. Whatever kids their age are doing is what they're more interested in doing. And they need privacy. They need respect. They need independence. We can't discipline or punish children who are teenagers in the same way we could when they were children, and we have to have better experiences with them around sexual behavior when they're older. I want to respond to this question: how do we talk to our children about sex? And I'm assuming this is about sexual experiences, but it should also expand to our our sexuality and who we are as sexual creatures. First of all, children will ask questions from a young age. Do not punish them. Even children, when they're 3 and 4 years old, they ask questions about genitals. Do you have a penis, daddy? Do you have a bosom, mommy? Uh, why is your breast that way? Why is your tummy that way? And it's important to answer them with a very simple response when they're young. And as they get older, as if they learn that they can ask you questions and you'll respond without making them feel ashamed or without making them think that they're perverted to ask questions, they will continue to ask you questions into their teenage years. But if you respond to them in a very punishing attitude when they're small or shameful, or you get embarrassed, they will learn that this is something they should never talk about and that you are the last person that they should ask any questions of. You can ask some of them questions as they become a little bit older, maybe in the in the range of 7 to 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years. Have your friends talked to you about sex? What are kids saying in school about sex? What do their parents tell them? Now, you might think no one's saying anything, but children do talk about sex. They most definitely do. And many children learn about sex from each other or from the internet. So someone's going to come to school and say something at recess when they're playing, and we'll talk about it. It's important that you're able to moderate some of that. What did those children think about what their parents said? What do you think about what your friends said? What do you and your friends think about sex education at school? If there's any biology of reproduction that's discussed or any sexual education, what we know is that many schools do not provide sexual education. They say this is the job of parents, but I can tell you that parents typically fail on this. And we'll talk about that momentarily. Does anyone talk to you about sex? Have you had anyone talk to you about it? Do you ever feel pressure from your friends about sexual behavior or doing a certain sexual act? This is important to ask kids, especially when they are able to tell us that they've heard things, or they might be able to say, what does that mean? Or how do people do that thing that I keep hearing about? And it's important to give clear but very, very simple answers. And as they get older, you want to give the children, especially teenagers, appropriate resources so that they can ask about it without being embarrassed. If you're talking to your children in pre-adolescence, then they'll probably talk to you during adolescence. If you don't, they probably won't. They will be mortified by conversations in their teenage years if suddenly you start talking to them about it. Don't try to get everything in one big talk, a little bit at a time. You're teaching your children that you're a safe parent. Be approachable. If you talk to them often and answer their questions honestly, they will be much more likely to talk to you about important things. Let them know that they're sexually normal. And this means when their bodies start to develop and when they ask questions. Speak naturally as possible, even though many of us, when our children or grandchildren ask us questions, we take a deep breath to steady ourselves because sometimes we're not used to using sexual language in a helpful way. Don't focus just on sexually transmitted diseases or pregnancy. Talk about sexual competence and commitment and the pleasure and the blessing that God has given us this very special gift. Don't make it terrifying. Don't turn it into an inquisition. Stay calm. Children might try to shock you by sharing what they know. I know that I did when I was a teenager. I said to my mother one time, Mommy, and I remember she was making breakfast, and I said this just to see how she would react. Not because I had any sexual activity at that age. I just wanted to test my mother. And I said, Mommy, what would you do if I came home from school or from the doctors and told you that I was pregnant? Well, my mother sucked in all the air in the room and turned and looked at me with this horrified look. And she said, "You'd better not be pregnant." And I laughed because, of course, I wasn't. But I learned something, that my mother would have a very strong reaction. And so I learned, as most teenagers do, by testing behaviors, whether or not a parent is safe to ask specific questions to. Pay attention to adolescents when they start muttering and you're never quite sure what they're really trying to say. Engage them, get them to talk. This should not be a one-way presentation where you say, "Sit down and listen, I'm going to give you my wisdom." Ask them what they know, ask them what they think. Provide them with resources that are credible, and you might be that resource, so they can ask information without feeling embarrassed. Let them know you're always interested to know if they have questions. You always want to protect their privacy. And sometimes a child will come to you and say, "Please don't tell Dad that I got my period for the first time, that I'm menstruating." Well, it's important that you respect their privacy. Dad will probably figure it out, but honor the request. Avoid having just instruction. Many of us, we speak to younger children purely in an instructive way, and we don't answer questions. We don't find out what they think. And it's important that we demonstrate respect and that we say, "What ideas do you have about that?" That's how we correct their ideas, by getting them out in the open, not by saying, "How dare you raise this topic," and embarrassing them. So over the years, I've collected a lot of things that kids have said, kids of a variety of ages, about the talk, the sex talk, how parents have tried to say things to their kids. Here's what some people have said, and some of you can relate to these things. "What my father told me may have been helpful when he was my age, but it was all stuff I knew back when I was 11. Okay, so again, he thought he was doing a good thing, and maybe when he was 11, this was important. But because of the internet, because of how kids talk, because of HBO television, because of all these things, kids are getting exposed to sexual behavior much earlier. My mother took me aside the day of the wedding and tried to give me, there it is, the talk. It was humiliating, irrelevant, and too late. I was getting married in an hour." Well, this is sad, but this is what happens a lot of times. And I know of many young adults who don't get relevant, helpful talk, either in premarital counseling or from their parents. If kids are getting premarital counseling, there needs to be explicit conversation about sexual arousal, about how sex works, what the mechanics are, how to honor each other, how to respect each other, how to be non-exploitive, and how to truly enjoy the experience. My mother said not one word about sex. My father just said, "Don't ever come into this home pregnant." I didn't even know how I could get pregnant. Now, this was just said to me last week. So again, we're missing the mark on this. It was totally useless and really embarrassing. I think this is a call for all parents, all pastors, all counselors to be appropriate, to learn how to have these conversations. Someone did say, "I could always ask my parents about sex, and they've answered my questions with good answers since I was small." And this was the child of two doctors who could ask a question and they would get the information they needed. Why is it so hard to talk about sex with our family members? It's often because we didn't get good sex education ourselves. It's also because we might not have seen good, healthy expressions of sexual attraction or affection between our parents. We might be very afraid that if we talk about sex, the kids are going to want to run out and try to have sexual experience, and we don't want that. Actually, it's been proven over and over and over that when kids are given appropriate, simple information, they are less likely to run out and try it, especially when we talk about how it's a gift from God, and we talk about how wonderful it is in the bonds of marriage, that it's for a special time, rather than to say, don't you dare, and to scare our children. Many people are so frightened about sexual behavior, about the sinfulness of sexual behavior. How do you think that those who are abstinent before marriage are able to suddenly enjoy sex when they've heard all this time that it's sinful, it's awful, you'll get a disease, you'll get pregnant, it's horrible, don't do it, everyone's going to know? Well, that is no kind of education that we should really consider giving our kids. The other thing is, we don't want to say the wrong thing, use the wrong words, and we only use the spiritual lens. Some of you might remember from our first conversation that I provided this model, the spiritual, the moral, and the clinical aspects of a situation. Many of us only talk about a spiritual aspect of sexual behavior. It is sinful, it is within the bonds of marriage, etc. We often don't talk about the moral aspects, and by that I mean what is fair, what is respectful, what has integrity, what is mutual. The other thing we don't talk about is the clinical aspect of sexual behavior. Oh yes, we talk about sexual disease, we talk about pregnancy, but we often don't talk about how sex is good for us. So it's important to have more to say about sex than just about sinfulness and righteousness. Some important points. I realize I'm going a bit long on this conversation, but I want to make sure you have this information. Girls inhabit a completely different world than boys. And that comes to when it comes from sex, when it comes to their experience in the world. Self-esteem of boys and girls grows at the same pace until they get to puberty. And then boys' self-esteem goes up and girls' self-esteem goes way down. Why is that? Because girls realize that they don't get reinforced for the same things. They don't get the praise for the same things that boys do. They are suddenly expected to be sexual gatekeepers. They are responsible for male happiness, plus their own. They are rewarded for neglecting their own development and paying attention to the men in their community, the males in their family, the needs of everyone else, the needs of younger children. And they're not rewarded for exhibiting good leadership qualities or being resolute or expressing opinions and having strong emotions. Whereas boys will be considered being good leaders when they make an emphatic point, and girls are considered unladylike. Pay attention, because every single one of these aspects have a direct bearing on how girls feel entitled to a positive sexual experience in their future. Now, I want to say something about premarital abstinence, because I just know someone will say, well, don't you think we should be teaching our children to abstain? Yes, I think this is the ideal. It is a behavioral goal, but what we know is that it is often not reached. And we should not be shaming children for the rest of their lives because they did not abstain before marriage. So I'm thinking I could be drummed out of camp for my views on this, but I have to tell you, I have more individuals in therapy for sexual concerns who did not abstain before, who learned bad sexual habits and were given a lot of shame because of this. One of them said in a very poignant way, attention is continually made to what I did in my body before marriage rather than what Jesus did in his body because I did this. Jesus' death on the cross was so that we don't have to keep people in shame their whole lives. So again, I've mentioned that women who abstain from sex before marriage have said to me over and over, I'm supposed to abstain. How do I go from 0 to 100 in one night? If I wasn't even supposed to think about sex before marriage, how can I do that? It's overwhelming, and I'm still struggling with this aspect of my marriage. We have to have better conversations. We have to stop shaming children from understanding that their bodies are sexual. But we need to do a better job at teaching boundaries and the joy that God has given us. I want to just say this one thing. Ellen White, in her book, Steps to Christ, or actually Steps to Jesus, said this: God does not look on all sins as equally bad. To him, as to us, some sins are worse than others. But even if some wrong acts appear small to us, no sin seems small to God. Human judgment is often wrong, but God sees things as they really are. People dislike a drunk person and say his sin will keep him out of heaven. But often these same people say nothing against pride, selfishness, and greed. Yet these are sins that especially offend God because they are so different from his loving character. Unselfish love fills every heart in heaven. A person who makes a big mistake and sins may feel ashamed. He may feel that he needs the grace of God, but a proud person feels no need, so he closes his heart against Christ and the wonderful blessings he came to give. I think this is a sober warning that we need to have a whole different attitude toward those who are unable to abstain before marriage or who choose not to. Our goal is to make sure that people enter into marriage purely with chastity. It is a beautiful experience when a couple can begin their life together, having abstained from sex before marriage. But let us not make this a test of fellowship, because there are many people who exhibit sin that go unrebuked. And if we are going to continually point out sexual sin in the Christian church, we need to do it in a much different way than we have in the past. When people have sex before marriage, many times they learn what I call guilty sex. They're hurried, it's non-mutual, they are not able to fully enjoy the experience. They're not able to slow down the process and communicate well. And the relationship conflict can become focused on their sexual withholding or participation, and they start pulling away from each other because they don't want to cross the line again. So this is an issue that I'm hopeful that we can always pay attention to ourselves, how we set examples, how we talk to our kids. I'm going to put this up here. I'm not going to spend time on it, but if those who are watching this video later choose to look at each one of these items, you can stop the film and look at it here. And lastly, some healthy sex life characteristics for those who are married, a strong communication style about difficult issues in general life, but also in sexual life. The ability to negotiate decisions, acceptance of flaws and quirks without rehearsing them, loving each other, expressing affection frequently, physical attraction, mutual participation in a variety of non-sexual activities, willing to make time for each other, and prioritizing sexual and emotional experience. Remember the statement, we need to teach children to do as we do, not as we say. And if that's true, we need to be exhibiting a lot healthier relationship than many of us do. Do our children see mutuality? Do they see love? Do they see affectionate behavior? Do they see playfulness? Do they see that you enjoy each other? We've all been to restaurants before and see a couple sit down and they have nothing to say to each other the whole meal. And we look at each other, we say, God forbid that I ever get to that point where I don't have a spark in my eye when I see my partner come in the room. So I hope this is a helpful overview of sexuality and sexual behavior. And I realize I've gone a little bit long on this, but I think this is a topic of great interest to many people who might have joined us tonight.
Yes, Dr. Barbara, thank you so much for taking your time. We couldn't get our face off the screen. We are really so interested with what you have all shared. Thank you so much again for bringing us tonight to, I would like to say, a total re-education experience for the word sexuality, its dimensions, and how it is more an expression of our personhood. I really like that. And not on shame and a connotation of the bad word. So you have never failed to challenge our traditional understanding on every topic you have presented. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise tonight. And we have always learned really new and fresh insights. So the skills that you have taught us are really precious, especially for those parents who are dealing with different developmental stages with their children. And I myself was like, wow, this is so helpful. I believe our audience feels the same way. I could see how engaged our viewers, if you could just see the flooded reaction of hearts and thumbs up and all those reactions that they were approving and validating your presentation. So thank you so much. Now it's time for our question and answer. So I would allow me to present our PowerPoint for the question and answer. We have around 6 questions here. So I think you can take some time to really thoughtfully answer them all. So thank you so much for those who have submitted their questions. So let's start here with number 1. This is a very thoughtful question too. Is it appropriate for people outside the family, like Sabbath school or Pathfinder teachers, to give sex talk to children or teens?
Well, this is indeed a really good question. And I think that a couple things. I think we have to, again, consider the setting, the context. Mostly, if a Sabbath school teacher or a Pathfinder leader is going to be giving a talk, the parents should approve that.
Okay.
What we know about people who victimize children is that many people who victimize children will gravitate toward roles where they interact with children a lot, either as a teacher, someone who takes kids camping or babysits, or it can be anything. We have to protect our children. And the parents should have the right to say whether or not they want that particular individual to say anything. They should approve what's going to be said. So this really should come from the family. Now, often the family says nothing of real value to the children. And so children are very curious, and children might ask a trusted teacher. And if that's the case, I think it's really important that you give them some kind of resource. I think that I think we have to be very careful of this, because we never want to give the appearance that we were talking about sex with kids who might, and our behavior might be misconstrued to be victimizing or exploitive. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think some broad statements that are age appropriate. God has given us this wonderful gift. Isn't it wonderful that families can be formed? Things that are very, very broad. But when you have someone giving real explicit, specific information about sexual acts or sexual behavior to children, I'm always very concerned about that.
Wow. Thank you so much. I think I really like your emphasis in the whole presentation about safety, respect, and protection. These are
Yes.
really big words that we just kind of like shoo away because, like, it's bad. That's it. That's the end of the story.
Yes,
So
and I think, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
it's okay, no problem.
I think it is very easy to mis-socialize
Yeah.
children around issues of sexuality. They will do what a teacher or a Pathfinder leader says to do because that person has authority, and they feel that they, even if they're uncomfortable with what's being said, they might not speak back. So I think it's important to empower them to say, you know, we'll answer your questions at home. Please bring the questions at home.
You know, I really pray that this is the kind of sexual education that our children would get at school. This, how simple and how appropriate it is. Thank you so much. Now, second question. In the last 20 years, there was an emphasis on purity, commitments to purity in the Christian context. Now, I'm reading things written by Christians who say this was damaging. Wow. What do you think about this? Is it not healthy to emphasize waiting until marriage?
I
Please.
am really glad this question has been asked. Just this week in my class, one of our Loma Linda graduates in the School of Behavioral Health shared her dissertation about the experience of young women in what we call the purity culture.
Oh,
And I think that I want to say two things. It is not healthy it is not unhealthy to emphasize waiting until marriage. It is not unhealthy. It is not a
okay.
bad thing. Let me say this, though. When women are taught that their sexuality belongs to their father or to Ellen White or to the church or to their parents, we do them an enormous disservice.
Oh,
Because why would you protect something that doesn't even belong to you, that you have no
right.
personal ownership over? And this is the reason why I suggested that when our little girls are being potty trained, we give them names for what it is that they own and what they're protective of. Because if we
Mm,
don't, there's no commitment there. So again, purity is very important. God expects purity of all of us, but he expects us to own our own sexuality, our own experience. And in that sense, it was exceptionally damaging to think that people's sexuality belonged to somebody else.
mm,
It belongs to us, and we stand before God as individuals. And when we are of age, we don't stand behind our parents in line and say, well, ask my parents, this belonged to them, or the church, or the pastor, or our belief. It is our sexuality, and we promote a healthy sexuality. And part of that is waiting until marriage. But
wow.
it is very damaging when we don't believe that it's ours.
Wow, I really like that emphasis. You know, reimagining myself being oriented on ownership to my sexuality is really on a different level. Because yeah, you're right. It gives much more a responsibility on my own, not just because the church said so it's wrong. So I'm not dependent on anyone's opinion on my sexuality, but I own it. That is so wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Barbara. Now let's go to the third. What if you and your husband or wife have a difference in how frequently you're interested in sex? In a respectful relationship, what is the way to work through that? Yes, this is
Well,
important.
let me just say that most relationships, most husbands and wives have differences, both
Oh,
in terms of frequency, in style, uh, in many ways. Our sexual appetites are unique. Our libido, which is our sexual arousal, our sexual interest, is different in couples. It's a very common issue. And so, what do we do? One of the issues is we have to look long and hard at ourselves, first of all, especially the person who wants sex more often than the other partner and says to themselves, is there anything I can do that will give a better sexual experience to my partner? So, for example, I've heard men say, well, my wife never wants sex. Well, let's just see what your wife is doing. She gets up early in the morning. She makes breakfast for you and for the children. She gets them off to school. Then she goes to work. When she comes home, she starts a second shift by cleaning the house, making dinner, getting the lunches ready for the next day, and she falls into
Yeah.
bed exhausted, and you want her to have sex?
No.
If you want her to have sex, make dinner. If you want
Hmm.
her to have sex, take care of the children.
Wow.
Um, it, and if it's really interesting that men who vacuum and iron the clothes have a better sex life than those who don't. And it's
Wow.
really funny to me. Women are not shocked by this. Most women laugh when they hear that. And men think, well, wonder why that is. Well, it's because you're giving your partner more time to rejuvenate. Now, the other thing we know is that one of the greatest deterrents to sexual responsiveness is responsibility.
Yeah.
Now, let that sink in. What that means is if you hear a baby crying in the other room, there goes your libido out the window. If you have to be responsible for, you've got one ear down the hall because you hear the children, you're not going to be interested in sex.
Mm.
If you have all these worries of all these responsibilities, you cannot be. So I think what we have to do is look at ourselves first and say, what am I doing to allow that my partner to have more space to breathe so they're rested? Because especially for women, women have real difficulty engaging in sex when they're exhausted. Um, let's think about a couple other things.
Mhm.
Let's say that that's not the issue and there's just a difference in their libido. I think it's important to have a very candid conversation. How can I
Mhm.
honor you and how can you respect me? It might be a time of day. I know some men who have said to me in therapy sessions, when I wake up in the morning, I'm ready to go. That's when I want sex. My wife doesn't feel anything until noon.
Mhm.
She's not interested until evening. So how do we negotiate that?
Mhm.
Um, so I think that you have to have candid conversations about this. And this is difficult for many couples.
Mhm. Wow. I was like dumbfounded. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Barbara. I think what I really got there is that the openness and the the ability to create an environment where it's stress free for the other person, that the other person is more stressed, will have time to recover and make it that special for the two of you with appropriateness of time and rest. That is so beautiful and so thoughtful. Thank
And let
you.
me
Next,
let me let me
yeah,
just
sure.
let me just add quickly, a haggard person is not interested in sex.
Oh, yeah.
So how can you make the other person's life less haggard?
Right. Do the vacuum, husbands, and wash the dishes, please. Okay. So thank you so much for that. So this is a very good thing for the singles. Like you have ideas now on how you are going to openly process these differences. And I like your uniqueness of libido or the sexual appetite. These are very important. Thank you. And another question, as a single person, I don't need details at the moment, but I'm nervous about when the time comes around. I don't feel comfortable asking anyone for advice. How would I know how to have a good experience at that time? Wow.
This is really a great question.
Yeah.
Um, I was single for, late into my life. And so I can appreciate the concerns that single individuals have. Let me say this, our sexuality is not like a light switch that we turn on and off.
Okay.
And so when many people think I will become a sexual person when I get married, no, you're a sexual person now. How do you appropriately embrace that now?
Wow.
And I so people will often say, well, that's a great theory. What does that translate to? What do I actually do about that? And what I would say is we need to understand our bodies. We need to understand what feels good to us. We need to understand how to help a partner know what feels good to us. Um, and if we're not having sexual behaviors with other people, it's really important that you get some reputable uh, books, Christian books about sexual um, uh, sexuality and sexual behavior. There are some really, really good books. Maybe what I'll do just as we're closing, I have one other slide I can put on the screen that maybe
Sure.
you can take a picture of after our questions. So you can take a picture of that slide and look up some of these resources online, because there are some excellent resources for Christians who are in this position of the single person. How do I get the information I need in a reputable way? How do I understand myself as a sexual being without crossing boundaries that I shouldn't at this point? And so I think there are some very good things that can be available.
Wow, like sexual identity is very important to be established for in a single person's life before getting married. Thank you for that emphasis, Dr. Barbara. Now, this is the last question. How do we re-educate children who were oriented to shame with their sexuality? This is a very important practical way that you can share. And how are we going to re-educate those children around us?
Now, yes, thank you for raising that issue, because this is an enormously important issue. So many children, so many of us were raised with shame, because in those innocent years when we, might have walked into a room naked, or, and the parents panicked. It's like, how dare you, those kinds of, it starts in these very
Yeah.
seemingly appropriate ways. But when we ask questions, if parents don't give helpful responses, or if something is said that the child feels like they are bad and wrong, this can often set off an entire trajectory of feeling that sex is dirty or bad
Mm,
or wrong. And this is what we need to do. Is I think we need more sermons from the
mm.
pulpit about this beautiful gift that God gave us.
Oh,
Now, I've heard some very cringeworthy sermons about sex and sexuality. And as someone who teaches this at the university level, I'm pretty critical about sermons about sexuality. But
mm,
what I think is we need to have some very thoughtful conversations from the pulpit about the beautiful gift that God gave us. It is not dirty. It is a beautiful gift, and we don't unwrap it until our birthday. And
okay.
and yet we think how exciting it is and wonder what's in the box, so to speak, and how wonderful it is. I think that the book Song of Solomon describes sexual experience absolutely free of shame and judgment. It is beautiful. And yet, many times we focus on uh, biblical text about fornication, and we
Mm-hmm.
have people terrified that they might be guilty of fornication. Well, we never even define what fornication is.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're always afraid. And I think we need to stop using fear tactics. We need to stop
Yeah.
instilling shame. And so
Right.
if people have already felt shame, I think it's very difficult not to feel that way, but
Right.
to explain this is why this is a gift from God. This is a beautiful thing. It's not dirty, it's not ugly. And if children might have been sexually assaulted or sexually abused or sexually mis-socialized, then it might be
Mm-hmm.
helpful to have conversations with them about the fact that your body, we don't feel shame about the way our elbow
Mm-hmm.
works. Why do we feel shame about how our genitals work?
Mm-hmm.
Our mouth works just fine. What's wrong with being happy that our genitals work just fine, and that this is a reason to give us joy? Parts of our genitals were created for no functional purpose other than to create arousal and excitement.
Wow.
So, a God
Yes.
who would create our
Sorry.
bodies
Mm.
only for our pleasure is a
Mm.
very important aspect to teach us that sexual behavior is a good thing.
Wow. Thank you so much. And there are just 2 points there. Like, do not make it dirty. Do not make it horrifying. You have emphasized that a while ago, and thank you so much. Yeah, that is really very important. By the way, I would like to read this one comment from a parent here in the chat box that says, Thank you. The talk is very interesting. My 14-year-old daughter and 12-year-old son just walked away, and we kept silent during this presentation. I don't know if it was appropriate or not. We usually do not talk on this subject. We probably need to talk on the subject. It was very valuable, informative subject for us who come from a conservative society. So it comes from a student here at IS. And yeah, this is really, really very important topic. So thank you. Now we have one last question. Is it
Okay.
okay? Here, this is from like a senior citizen who is trying to express the need for sexual expression between couples. So when married couple get old, they also think they are no longer capable to express sexuality. So how can this be, rekindled, and how can age not diminish the value of sexuality? Thank you.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad this question was asked because,
Yeah.
couples can easily have a very robust and healthy and happy sex life into their 80s. Into
Wow.
their 80s. Now, when I say that to my medical students, they kind of look at me like, "Oh, don't say that to me. I don't think I can take that." But these are the patients that they are going to be caring for. And
Mhm.
will the sexual expression be like it was when you were 20? Of course not. But I
Mm.
think we have pathologized older people who are interested in maintaining a sex life. And it
Mm.
is a normal, healthy, robust part of being an older person to have affection, to have sexual expression in whatever way the capacity is. We
What?
know that bodies change. We know there's something called
Mm.
andropause for men,
Yeah.
which is where their testosterone levels drop. We know that women have menopause. We know that our bodies change. We know that sexual intercourse can become uncomfortable unless a lot of lubrication is used or unless positions are used in sex that
Mm.
don't hurt your joints or that are, you can take more time. When you're younger, people are much more vigorous. When people are older, they can have very rewarding sex, but it might be more snuggly sex than it is, really wild, exciting sex. But
Mm.
sex is really important. Did you know that a good sexual experience, especially if an orgasm is achieved, did you know that that can protect against chronic pain for up to 8 hours? Did you know that it reduces risk of cardiac disease? Did you know it can reduce blood pressure, help you sleep better, reduce joint pain? Did you
Oh,
know that? So it's
that,
not a bad thing. There's also some limited evidence that it also reduces the likelihood of prostate cancer.
wow.
Sex is not bad for elderly. We just have to
Wow.
take a whole different approach. And I think
Mm.
it's really, really important that we are gracious, that we give our elders privacy and
Mm.
opportunity and respect.
Wow, thank you so much. You have, boost our elderly's confidence and esteem on this manner. I would really like, the physiological change, degradation or deterioration in some parts are not hindrance for creativity in our sexual expression. We cannot compare, but there is beauty at every level. So
Absolutely.
wow, this is such a very beautiful time. And Dr. Barbara, if you want to share that one slide that you want
Yes,
to
let me
share,
put this
please?
up here for you very quickly. It is the last slide on this presentation. Here we go. So you might want to take a picture of this with your phone
Mm.
so that you can, or when you come back to look at this, you can stop the film and you can just copy some of these things. There are some very good books that are age appropriate. What's Happening to Me and Where Did I Come From? Um, His Needs, Her Needs, Making Romantic Love Last. So I think some of these are quite good. There's also some good articles here. So I'll take the slide down if you'd like, but
Mhm.
maybe some people would like to make sure they have a picture of
Yeah.
this. Um,
Wow, thank you so much. You never really, as what I said, you never have failed us to you never failed to surprise us and to enrich us in every session. So thank you again so much. Like, we are really blessed. I know the community is also very, very blessed. So I believe we are so privileged again of your time, and the whole community is rejoicing with us tonight. So
Thank
before we
you.
close, let me give this invitation for people out there. We have been joined by so many people coming from different places. They are not just coming from IAS, but all over, like, where IAS alumni are present. So thank you so much. So again, I would like to invite everyone to join us every third Sunday of each month. This is a series that started last August 2021, and it will end July 2026, 2022. So mark your calendars and don't miss this timely opportunity to listen to topics related to growing healthy family relationships. So we are very privileged that for this whole year series, we have Dr. Barbara to share her expertise. So please know that this presentation is recorded, and you can find this through our two media platforms, the account name in FB IS and in YouTube IS Media. So I hope you will not fail to share this to people, to parents, and to single individuals that you know that might need this one. So see you all on March 20th. Okay, March 20th for the third Sunday of March with a topic. This is another very relevant and important one: relationship gone wrong. When family relationships go horribly wrong. So, again, we will learn more insights from Dr. Barbara. So, this concludes our webinar tonight. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here. Thanks again for joining us tonight, and we will see you next month for the next presentation. God bless and have a great week, everyone. Bye bye.